People think betrayal arrives loudly, doors slammed, voices raised, tempers flaring. But in my life, betrayal always came softly, wrapped in smiles and polite conversations, disguised as concern. That's how I learned early on to prepare in silence. The house had been my entire world long before it ever became an estate. It sat at the edge of a sleepy street, its white paint faded by decades of sun and rain, its porch boards singing under familiar footsteps. My grandparents' laughter lived in those walls. I grew up there, learning to read on the living room rug, tracing my fingers along the grooves of the dining table they built together, falling asleep to my grandmother's humming drifting down the hallway. My parents visited, but they never stayed long. They always talked about the house as if it were already theirs, pointing out what they would change, what they would sell, what they would fix. My sister absorbed that tone early. She walked through rooms like a future owner, not a guest. I learned to shrink. To listen. To remember. When my grandparents passed, grief hollowed me out, but responsibility filled the space it left behind. I stayed. I paid bills. I mowed the lawn. I repaired the leaking faucet myself because calling my parents meant opening a door I wasn't ready to face. The house wasn't just shelter, it was my last connection to unconditional love. Graduation came quietly. No party. No crowd cheering my name. Just a diploma in my hands and a sense that I was standing at the edge of something fragile. My parents congratulated me with a quick phone call. My sister texted a single emoji. But something in me shifted that day. Independence sharpened my instincts. That was when I started noticing things I had once brushed aside, how my mother asked about property taxes, how my father casually mentioned estate planning, how my sister joked about which room she'd take someday. They said it lightly, but their eyes always lingered on the house. So I listened. And then, quietly, I acted. 2 weeks after graduation, I sat alone in a modest law office with outdated magazines and the hum of an old printer filling the air. My hands shook as I signed my name, but my voice didn't. The lawyer explained everything carefully, what a trust meant, how it protected assets, how ownership couldn't be seized or rewritten by family pressure. "This is just in case," I said, repeating the words like a shield. He nodded, as if he'd heard that sentence 100 times before. When I walked back onto the porch that afternoon, the house looked the same. The wind stirred the maple leaves. The steps creaked beneath my feet. No one knew what I'd done. And that was the point. For the first time in my life, I had chosen myself, quietly, deliberately, and without asking permission. I didn't know when the storm would come. I only knew I was finally ready. They came on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, as if they had every right to. I was in the kitchen rinsing a coffee mug when I saw their car pull into the driveway. My first instinct was the old one: brace, straighten, prepare to explain myself. Then I reminded myself, this is my house. By the time I opened the door, they were already halfway up the porch steps. My mother hugged me too tightly, the way she always did when she was pretending affection. My father followed, surveying the porch with quiet ownership. My sister stepped inside last, her eyes roaming the living room as if she were mentally rearranging the furniture. "We thought we'd stop by," my mother said brightly. Family meeting. That phrase alone made my chest tighten. We sat around the dining table my grandfather had built with his own hands. I noticed how my sister didn't bother to ask before taking his chair. That small, careless act cut deeper than I expected. My father cleared his throat. "We've taken care of some paperwork." My sister smiled then, wide and confident, like someone already holding the prize. She slid a folder across the table, stopping it just short of my hands. "We had the house signed into my name," she said. It made the most sense. The words didn't register at first. They floated in the air, unreal, like a foreign language. "You'll need to be out by Friday," my mother added gently. "We don't want this to get messy." Out. No discussion. No acknowledgement of the years I'd spent here alone. No mention of my grandparents' wishes. Just an assumption that I would comply the way I always had. My sister leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. You can stay with a friend or something. You're young, you'll figure it out. The old version of me would have cried. Would have argued. Would have begged them to remember who I was, what this place meant. I felt that instinct rise like a reflex. But something steadier replaced it. I looked at their smiling faces, faces that had watched me grow, fail, succeed, and still saw me as expendable. And suddenly, the pattern was clear. This wasn't new. This was simply the moment they stopped pretending. I smiled. Not a bitter one. Not a forced one. Just calm. You really think I'd let that happen? I asked. My sister laughed out loud. Oh my God. You always think you're smarter than you are. My father shook his head, amused. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. They stood, already done with the conversation. My mother kissed my cheek like this was an act of kindness. We'll come back Friday to make sure everything's cleared out, she said. The door closed behind them, leaving the house unnaturally quiet. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the ticking clock my grandmother loved. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from clarity. The betrayal hurt, yes, but it also freed me. There was no confusion left. No illusion to protect. I walked to my room, opened my desk drawer, and pulled out the copies of the documents I had signed weeks ago. They thought they had already won. They had no idea the game had ended before it even began. Friday arrived wrapped in the kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle. The sky was overcast, heavy with unshed rain, and the house seemed to hold its breath with me. I woke early, not from anxiety, but from certainty. Today was the day the truth would finally stand in the open. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the mug, staring at the front door. Every tick of the clock echoed through the house like a countdown. This was the same table where my grandparents once planned birthdays and laughed over crossword puzzles. Today, it would witness something else, an ending. At exactly 10 o'clock, the rumble of an engine rolled down the street. I looked out the window and saw the moving truck first, large, white, confident. Then my parents' car. Then my sister's. They lined up in the driveway like they owned it already. I didn't rush. I didn't hide. I simply stood and walked toward the door. When I opened it, I saw their smiles again, sharp, victorious. My sister was already talking to the movers, pointing toward the porch. Careful with the banister, she said. It's old. She stopped mid-sentence. Because she finally noticed him. A man stood on the porch where my grandfather used to sit in the evenings. Tall. Composed. Dressed in a tailored coat that didn't belong to someone here to argue. In his hands was a thick folder, neatly labeled. My mother frowned. Who is this? The man spoke before I could. Good morning. I'm the legal trustee and representative of this property. The word trustee landed like a stone dropped into water, ripples of confusion spreading across their faces. My father stepped forward. That's not necessary. We've already handled the ownership. The man nodded politely. No, sir. You haven't. He opened the folder. Paperwork rustled in the breeze. Dates. Signatures. Stamps. The quiet, undeniable language of law. This estate was transferred into an irrevocable trust shortly after the owner's graduation, he continued. Any documents you've obtained after that date hold no legal authority. My sister's smile collapsed. That's not possible, she whispered, turning to me. You didn't. I stepped onto the porch beside him. I did, I said. For the first time, they looked at me, not as the afterthought, not as the obedient child, but as a stranger they no longer understood. You went behind our backs, my mother said, her voice shaking. No, I replied evenly. I protected what was left to me. The man continued, unbothered. Your attempted eviction is invalid. Any further attempts to remove the occupant will be documented as harassment. The movers shifted uncomfortably. One of them cleared his throat and stepped back toward the truck. My father's face hardened, but there was nothing he could do. The authority standing on that porch didn't belong to him anymore. "This is ridiculous," my sister snapped. "You can't just." "I can," I said. And I did. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Finally, the man closed the folder. "You'll need to leave the property now." The movers retreated. The truck engine shut off, then restarted. One by one, they climbed back into their vehicles. As they pulled away, my sister didn't look back. My mother did, but her eyes held something unfamiliar. Fear. The porch was quiet again. The man handed me the folder. "It's done." I watched the empty driveway, my heart steady. For the first time, they had arrived expecting to take something from me. And left with nothing at all. The house was quiet once more. Even the maple tree seemed to sway in recognition, leaves rustling like whispered congratulations. I set the folder down on the porch table, its weight heavier than the papers inside, carrying with it the silent authority I had always needed but never dared claim. I sank into the rocking chair my grandfather once used, the one with a cushion flattened by decades of his evenings spent here. I felt the air shift around me, not just relief, but the kind of satisfaction that doesn't need applause. It was quiet, patient, immutable. Justice, finally, had a voice. My family had left, humiliated and powerless, though I didn't relish it. I didn't want their fear to be my triumph. I wanted something quieter, something lasting, the knowledge that I had protected what was mine, that I could stand without apology. And yet, I remembered all the years of subtle erosion, the comments about my place in the family, the assumption that I would leave quietly, the smiles hiding knives. I had felt that for as long as I could remember. Every time they minimized my worth, I took it in silently, storing it like firewood for the winter. Today, that firewood became flames. I wandered through the house, touching surfaces that carried memory, the carved railing of the staircase, the dented spot on the kitchen counter where my grandfather dropped a jar of sugar, the worn carpet in my room where I once fell asleep reading. These were mine, not just because the law said so, but because I had loved them, preserved them, and fought quietly for them. My parents and sister had tried to rewrite history, but love and loyalty cannot be signed over in a folder. I thought about the confrontation on the porch. I replayed their faces, the smug certainty, the disbelief, the faint sting of fear. My sister had always assumed she could take what I had. My parents had believed that entitlement and bloodline were stronger than responsibility and care. I had proven them wrong without raising my voice. Without even needing anger. There was a sweetness in that. Not vengeance in the cruel sense, but the calm satisfaction of rightful authority. The kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing you acted with intelligence and integrity while others acted with greed and arrogance. I smiled, allowing it to linger. I moved back to the living room and opened the folder. Copies of the trust documents lay neatly inside, and for a moment, I allowed myself to think about the future. The house was no longer a relic of the past. It was a foundation for what I would build, a life unshaken by others' ambitions, a life I chose for myself. I knew they would call. They might argue, beg, or demand explanations. But the truth was set. The law was clear. And I was ready. No amount of yelling or pleading could undo what I had quietly secured. Sitting on the porch that evening, I watched the sun lower behind the maple tree, painting the white siding in gold. I breathed deeply, letting the warmth soak into me. I was no longer the quiet girl who waited for someone else to decide her worth. I was the one who decided it. This house, my grandparents' love, and everything it represented belonged to me. And for the first time, I felt the weight of that inheritance, not just of property, but of strength, patience, and unshakable self-respect. The past could try to haunt me. My family could try to take what they never earned. But I was ready. I had won in silence, and that silence was louder than any scream. I rose from the chair and stepped onto the porch. The folder rested on the table like a silent guardian. I whispered to the wind, to the empty street, to the house itself. This is mine. And nothing you try can change that. And for the first time in my life, I believed it with every fiber of my being.